Now, it was announced today that the former U.S. Secretary of Defense and the former U.S. Vice President Dick Cheney has died. Cheney, who served as Vice President under President George W. Bush from 2001 to 2009, was seen as a driving force behind the U.S. invasion of Iraq in March 2003. He was also viewed by some analysts as having been one of the most powerful vice presidents in U.S. history. Well, Dick Cheney has died at the age of 84. Well, for more, we can speak now to Ambassador James Jeffrey, who's a former Deputy National Security Advisor under President George W. Bush. Thank you very much indeed for speaking to us. You served as U.S. Ambassador to Turkey and Albania under President Bush. You were also the U.S. Ambassador to Iraq under President Obama. Do correct me if I'm wrong on any of that. A pleasure talking to you. What was your level of interaction with Vice President Dick Cheney as he was, and what will be your lasting memory of him?
Thanks for having me on, first of all. I was also, most importantly for this interview, Deputy National Security Advisor in the White House and dealt with him every day for 2 years. Dick Cheney was an elemental force in American policy, both domestic and, in particular, from my standpoint, foreign policy. In the end, President Bush was a strong leader and made the decisions, but Dick Cheney had a tremendous impact on him, particularly in the first term. The combination of Cheney and Rumsfeld, and they go back all the way to the Ford and Nixon administrations. They dominated foreign policy and pushed us into, in some ways, very strong confrontations, more so than we otherwise would have with Islam in general and in Iraq. Nonetheless, he will be remembered as one of the most important Republican figures of the last 50 years.
There were some who described him as having been the CEO of that Bush presidency. Would you agree with that assessment?
Again, I found President Bush to be a very strong leader, particularly in his second term. Also, in his second term, after he had fired Don Rumsfeld, and Dick Cheney was very unhappy about that, I found that more and more Cheney was sidelined, at least in foreign policy decisions, because the president turned to Steve Hadley, the National Security Advisor, Condoleezza Rice, the Secretary of State, and Bob Gates, the Secretary of Defense, for most of his policies, for most of his recommendations. Cheney wanted to take a much stronger line against Iran, a much stronger line against Russia. The president wasn't willing to do this. He was totally tied up with 2 wars already, and he didn't want a third or a fourth.
Of course, he was a leading advocate of the invasion of Iraq. And I'm just wondering whether you think that is perhaps the defining factor in his legacy. What are your thoughts?
Not exactly, because, look, in 1998, Congress passed overwhelmingly the Iraq Liberation Act, and President Clinton signed off on it. There was a broad consensus, believe it or not, in America that going into Iraq in 2003 was the right thing to do. Cheney was one of the leading advocates of it, but there was, again, broad support, including among the Democrats in Congress. Nonetheless, what he was a supporter of, and here there was a difference with President Bush, Condoleezza Rice, and other advisors, he didn't believe in the democracy agenda, which President Bush believed in his soul and heart. Cheney reminds me more of Kissinger, a little bit of Trump, but less isolationist, and maybe more of a Roman proconsul. You've got to make the rest of the world fear you if you want to maintain your top position. And for Cheney, America maintaining the top position, particularly militarily, was the core foreign policy goal.
In terms of his skill set, as someone who worked closely with him and who saw him up close and personal, what would you say his strongest hand was? What was he best at?
First of all, he was very self-confident and very, very knowledgeable. He had been the chief of staff to Gerald Ford. He had been the Secretary of Defense for George Bush Sr. He had risen to the very top of the Republicans in Congress. So he had a tremendous resume. and he was respected for that. The other thing is, and here I would contrast him, perhaps unfairly, in the case of Rumsfeld, with Don Rumsfeld. Rumsfeld was very difficult to deal with. Cheney was personally kind. He was calm. He would accept his defeats, and I saw him get a lot of defeats in the last years of the Bush administration. He didn't pull rank. He didn't say, hey, I'm the vice president, let's end this conversation. He would listen to everybody. And so he was actually pleasant to work with, even if one disagreed with him, and often we did, on policies.
Is there one vignette or one scene that perhaps in your mind overshadows all the others as perhaps being the most memorable moment or memorable encounter with Dick Cheney?
Yes, I was the acting national security advisor with Bush in Beijing for the Olympics, which turned out to be very serious because Russia invaded Georgia. And I was trotted out to give a press conference. And in the press conference, I was asked a question which I hadn't prepared for, although I should have thought of it, which was, are we prepared to rule out the use of force? And I said, the United States never rules out the use of force because that's a kind of fallback position. So I immediately get a call from Cheney saying, great, did the president authorize this? And I had to sadly disappoint him and say, no, this was Jim Jeffries' idea.
There are some who say he made a lasting impact on the US vice presidency, one that's even felt to this day. I mean, what do you think of that? And how do you think history will remember him?
Well, history will, rather like Henry Kissinger. I just did a review of the PBS Henry Kissinger memorial series. These people who emerged, as I did, from the turmoil of the 1960s and 70s in America, Vietnam, Watergate, and so on, they remain controversial figures. There's no doubt about it. There will never be a final historical judgment of Dick Cheney. I do not think that he contributed to a strengthened role of the vice presidency, because we certainly saw neither Joe Biden, although he was a very active vice president, nor Kamala Harris, nor Vice President Pence play a role anything like that. I think that J.D. Vance is trying to do that, but the jury is still out on whether he'll reach anything like the level that Dick Cheney reached. It was unique, I think, in post-war American history.
Just tell us, lastly, your own personal memory of working with Dick Cheney. I mean, what goes through your mind when you look back on your time working closely with him?
I was, in terms of policies, very closely aligned with Gates, Hadley, and Rice. And that was where the president was, which to some degree was my job, but we have our own personal responsibility to advise and think. And I was aligned with them, but at the time and ever since, particularly as we have watched over those 20 years from 2000 forward, Iran, Russia, and China, in a way, eat our lunch. Move aggressively ever more. We see the situation that's now stable for the moment with China. Let's hope it stays that way after the president's trip to Asia. We see this raging war of Russian aggression in Ukraine. And up until they were dramatically defeated, we had seen an Iranian march through the entire Middle East. I'm not so sure now, looking back, Dick Cheney was all that wrong.
Okay, and just lastly, I mean, he was somewhat estranged from the Republican Party of today. How do you think he will be remembered in the ranks of the current GOP leadership?
Donald Trump doesn't spend much time identifying himself with antecedents, be they Reagan, be they Eisenhower, be they Cheney, be they the Bush family. Among other Republicans, particularly in the Congress, especially in the Senate, that kind of Dick Cheney Republican Party, very anti-isolationist, somewhat more moderate than some of the things we see with the Trump administration. That still has a foothold in the party. It's somewhat undercover right now, but it will emerge.
Okay, well, we really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us. Ambassador James Jeffrey, thank you very much indeed, sir. Well, we're joined now by Reed Galen, who's the co-founder of the Lincoln Project and a former strategist for George W. Bush, John McCain and Arnold Schwarzenegger. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. He was described as having been one of the most powerful and polarizing vice presidents in U.S. history. What do you make of that?
Well, I would say that both of those things are true. I started working for Vice President Cheney during the 2000 campaign when he was President Bush's running mate. And what I would say is that there were very few people I ever came across who knew more about how the federal government worked, from the White House down to the lowest guy sitting at a desk in an agency or a committee somewhere than Dick Cheney. I would also say my experience was that he was very involved in all facets of policy, at least from my small perch, in which if he had a difference of opinion with the president's staff, then there was a very good chance that he was going to go directly to the president. And that is something no one else in the White House could do.
Some people described him as having been the CEO of George W. Bush's presidency. I don't know if you agree with that assessment, and just how much influence do you think he wielded?
Well, I'm not sure about the CEO moniker, but I do know that he had a very expansive belief in the executive, that the presidency and the administration should and can do what it feels like it needs to do, especially in the auspices of national security, which was such a focus of Bush's presidency after 9/11. So I think that he definitely had a perspective on those things. Whether or not he was the CEO, I'm not necessarily sure. I think that, for maybe a COO, Cheney did not like to be out front. He was someone who was very much someone who would much rather have had his counsel given and received in private rather than in public. I remember that the events that I attended with him, he much preferred speaking to a small group of people than to a crowd. He preferred individual conversations, as I recall. And so I think that, maybe chief operating officer. But again, remember, in the United States, the vice presidency has only two jobs: break a tie in the U.S. Senate when that happens, and wait for a terrible phone call. And from a historic perspective, Cheney vastly expanded the bounds of what the vice presidency was.
Yeah, I was going to say, what mark did he make on the vice presidency? It sounds like you've already answered it. And how have we seen that change reflected in the vice presidents we've seen since him?
I think we've gone back to a much more traditional vice presidency in which there are things that the vice president is involved in. He or she can certainly attend, I would say, any meeting they wanted to. But for the most part, they are there to carry the message for the White House and for the president, to provide counsel that very few other people can. Remember, the vice president's the one person in the White House or the government the president can't fire. But again, it is a much more specific and narrow role since Dick Cheney. Hard to believe that many presidents would want or favor something like the Cheney vice presidency represented.
I mean, from what you're telling me about him not particularly relishing in being in the public eye, I mean, am I right in thinking he never had his eye on the top job in the United States?
Well, he did briefly decide he wanted to run in 1993 and 1994. But following that, he chose to, go into private industry. And I think that was, frankly, probably the right move. He was a mastermind at political knife fighting and bureaucratic infighting, but he was not a traditional politician. He was not going to hand out candy. He was not going to kiss babies. That was never going to be his strong suit. He could deliver one-liners very, very well. He had a very wry sense of humor, but he was never going to be someone on the stump who was going to rally a crowd of 20,000 people to their feet.
And we're more than 20 years on now since the invasion of Iraq. And of course, Dick Cheney was a leading advocate of that invasion. Do you think that is probably the most significant issue that will define his legacy? What do you think?
I think it will be both national and domestic security, in which he and a lot of the people around him, and frankly, the President Bush as well, saw 9/11 and then the subsequent invasion of Iraq also as a necessity to increase domestic surveillance of American citizens with the Patriot Act, the formation of the Department of Homeland Security, and all of the things that ultimately Edward Snowden brought to light under the Obama administration. And so I think that, yes, Iraq will probably be the lever around which he is seen, simply because he and now the late Donald Rumsfeld were such proponents of an invasion of Iraq really right after 9/11. It was always on their list of things to do. And unfortunately, 9/11, for so many reasons, gave them the opportunity to press that case, not only to the president himself, but also to the American people.
And of course, this issue of the unfound weapons of mass destruction in Iraq was very much the justification for that Iraq war and the invasion of Iraq. Did he ever express any remorse, or did he ever publicly reconsider his position on that issue?
Not that I recall. I did read in one of the obituaries this morning that at some point, even he gave up saying that Iraq was about weapons of mass destruction, that it had been so thoroughly debunked that it wasn't a worthy talking point anymore. And I hate to make invasion of a country a talking point, but I think that ultimately he knew that that was a reasoning that was not going to hold any credibility or any water with anybody who had any real understanding of what happened over there.
And one of the obituaries I read said that he defended the use of torture and stood by that. I mean, is that something that hung over him as being perhaps a legacy-defining issue?
I would say that of all of the things about Dick Cheney, and there are many, that is one that is certainly potent, but I'm not sure how well known it will be. I think probably more well known would be the opposition to another former boss of mine, John McCain, who obviously suffered severe torture in North Vietnam during his captivity. But again, I don't think a shining moment for America, either from a moral perspective or an intelligence perspective. As we know, torture rarely produces the results that people want because, as you know, people will say anything they want to get it to stop.
Yeah, we've just had a reaction coming into us while we've been talking. The former US President George W. Bush calling Dick Cheney's death, quote, a loss to the nation, a sorrow to his friends. One of his friends probably wasn't Donald Trump. And, it seems like he wasn't really on the best terms with President Trump. He said he was, in fact, going to vote for Kamala Harris last year. Why did Dick Cheney not see eye to eye with Donald Trump?
Well, I think there were a few things. First and foremost, I think the fact that President Trump had gone out of his way to say bad things about Cheney's daughter, Liz, who was a member of Congress from his home state of Wyoming. She had served on the January 6th committee. She had been thrown out of Republican leadership and then subsequently lost her seat in Wyoming. And I think that they saw Trump as a dangerous break. And I think that I probably agree with some of this, with what America's place in the world had been and what the rule of law meant. But I think that there was very much a dual feeling about Trump from Cheney's side, which was one of it was very personal, and the other one was someone who was hell-bent on dismantling a system that Dick Cheney was a core part of, going back to when he was the youngest chief of staff at the White House in the 1970s at 34.
So clearly, Dick Cheney was estranged from the GOP as it is today. I mean, we had reaction, as I said earlier, from the former President George W. Bush. But what sort of reaction do you think we'll get from the Republican Party leadership today?
Well, let me just tell you, I was in London last year doing an event, and I was sitting next to a young man who was a very, very, how would I say it, enthusiastic member of the MAGA coalition. And he said, I heard you worked for Dick Cheney. And I said, yes. He said, if we had it my way, he'd be in The Hague. And so I think that that's how you see it, which is he is first and foremost seen as a paragon of a system that they loathe, but also of, the antithesis of what I think that some MAGA members, a lot of MAGA members have, is a more isolationist worldview, that the United States should not go into foreign wars for no reason, something that Donald Trump is now threatening to do on multiple locations. So I think that there will be very little love lost and very little mourning out of MAGA or Donald Trump, for that matter, for Vice President Cheney.
And Reed, just before we wrap up, I mean, you said you'd met Dick Cheney on a number of occasions. It sounds like you accompanied him on various engagements. How will you remember him?
Look, as a staffer, he was always very nice. If you did your job, he was happy. I would say that there were moments where he was never going to be, look, when you're Vice President of the United States or running to be Vice President of the United States, you got a lot on your mind. But there was no one who knew more about what was going on than him. And there were times when he could be uproariously funny, but he did it in such a dry and deadpan manner that you had to sort of take a step back and go, wait, was he just funny? And so I think that was also, like, I have the rosy glasses of nostalgia helping me out. When I worked for him, it was pre 9/11. It was pre Iraq. It was pre the financial meltdown. It was a different time. It was a more, frankly, innocent time for me anyway. And so those are the memories I have, which obviously many people won't share. But you can only remember the things that you saw in person. And for me, I wish his legacy would be different, but here we are.
All right, we really appreciate you sharing that with us. Reed Galen, co-founder of the Lincoln Project. Thank you very much indeed for your time.